On July 4, 2026, a group of friends left a private dock in Ocean Springs, Mississippi, headed for a remote island in the Gulf of Mexico. It was a holiday, it was summer, and the plan was simple: spend the day at the beach to celebrate Independence Day. One of them never came back. 2 days later, the body of 18-year-old Nolan Wells was found floating in the water off the northwest tip of Horn Island by a National Park Service ranger. More than 3 weeks later, the cause of death remains undetermined. There are no suspects, there are no charges, and the case has become one of the most talked about in the United States in 2026, not just because of the mystery surrounding Nolan's final hours, but because of what it exposed about race, credibility, political division, and who gets heard when a family asks for answers. This video will not tell you what happened to Nolan Wells. Nobody knows yet. Not the sheriff's office, not the family's own legal team, not the independent forensic pathologist who examined his body a second time. What we're going to do instead is carefully reconstruct, piece by piece, exactly what is known so far, in the order it became known, and be honest about where the gaps are that more than 3 weeks of investigation still hasn't filled. Nolan Wells was born and raised in Ocean Springs, a coastal city just east of Biloxi, on Mississippi's Gulf Coast. In 2025, he graduated from Ocean Springs High School, where he played football. His high school coach, Jake Bramlett, remembered him as an athlete who stood out less for his statistics and more for his character, humility, respect for teammates and coaches, and a willingness to put in work that other players didn't see. After high school, Nolan enrolled at Southwest Mississippi Community College, roughly 2.5 hours inland, where he played wide receiver on the football team. Friends and family describe him as someone who had found his footing there, a young man with a future in front of him. He was set to head back to campus for preseason training within days of the 4th of July when he disappeared. At home, his family remembers him as the funniest one in the house, someone who made a point of showing up for his younger siblings, of being present in small, ordinary ways. On July 3rd, the day before the boat trip, he cooked salmon for the family dinner before heading out to spend the night with friends ahead of the holiday. It was the last time his mother, Christine Wansley, saw her son alive. Before we get further into what happened on July 4th, it helps to understand exactly where it happened because the geography of this case matters. Horn Island sits roughly 10 miles off the Mississippi Gulf Coast, south of Ocean Springs, part of a chain of barrier islands that also includes Petit Bois Island, Ship Island, and Cat Island. It is federally protected land, part of the Gulf Islands National Seashore, a National Park Service unit that stretches across Mississippi and Florida and draws millions of visitors a year, most of them to its more developed sections. Horn Island itself is deliberately undeveloped. There are no facilities. There is no drinking water. There is no ranger station or staff permanently stationed on the island. There is no cell phone service. There is no bridge, no ferry, and no road. The only way to get onto Horn Island and the only way to get off of it is a private or chartered boat. For families who grew up along the Mississippi coast, a trip like this isn't exotic or unusual. Boating out to the barrier islands for a day of isolated, undeveloped beach is a normal weekend activity, something Nolan's own family says he had done before, including with some of the same friends. The island itself has a long history, formed by sediment carried by rivers and currents thousands of years ago, named, according to local historians, after a soldier who lost a powder horn there during early French exploration of the coast and later designated a wildlife refuge, then folded into the national seashore, then declared a federally protected wilderness area in the late 1970s. It survived Hurricane Katrina in 2005 and the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2011. What all of that history adds up to for the purposes of this case is simple. Horn Island is beautiful, remote, unsupervised, and, according to people who know its waters well, dangerous in ways that aren't obvious from the shore. According to Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter, Nolan left a private dock in the Ocean Springs area sometime in the afternoon of July 4th on a boat with a group of friends, bound for Horn Island. Investigators have said the exact time he was last seen isn't entirely clear, but it was during that afternoon. Photos from the group that day, since shared publicly by the family and by media outlets covering the case, show Nolan smiling, wearing blue swim trunks and sunglasses, his arm around the friends he'd traveled out with. By late afternoon, the group made its way back to the mainland. Nolan was not with them. According to Sheriff Ledbetter, speaking to ABC News, the initial understanding among investigators, based on interviews with people who were on the island that day, was that Nolan chose to stay behind voluntarily, expecting to catch a ride back later with someone else. That account has not gone unchallenged. Javon Williams, a friend of Nolan's who was also on the island that day, told CNN that this version of events doesn't match the person he knew. Nolan did not have his phone with him when his body was eventually found, a detail that would go on to become one of the most heavily scrutinized points in the entire case. Layered onto that already uncertain picture is a second boat and a second set of events that unfolded that same afternoon. Around 4 p.m. on July 4th, a boat carrying some of Nolan's friends, a different vessel from the one he had originally set out on, ran into mechanical trouble near the western tip of Horn Island. A recording of the resulting emergency call was later released by the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, and portions of it have since been reported by NBC News, TMZ, Newsweek, and local Mississippi outlets. In the recording, the boat's operator, one of Nolan's friends, can be heard telling a dispatcher for Seatow, a private towing service, that the boat's bilge pump had failed and that it was taking on water. He asks to be towed back to shore. The call is chaotic. The caller struggles to provide membership information for the towing service. He gives confusing answers when asked how many people are aboard and what their ages are. The dispatcher, working to relay the situation to a towboat captain, describes a group of young people on the water who sound panicked. By the time the tow captain reaches the boat's owner, he's told that the situation has already been resolved and that the people aboard don't need assistance after all, despite what they had just told the dispatcher moments earlier. One of Nolan's friends, Warren Hudson, later discussed that day on a podcast. He said he hadn't been on that particular boat with Nolan, but that the two of them had a couple of conversations on the island earlier in the day. Hudson said he ended up riding back to the mainland on the boat that started taking on water, that the friend heard on the recording did in fact help get everyone back safely, and that Nolan made the choice to stay behind once that boat began having problems. News organizations that have reviewed the recording in full have been careful to note what it does and doesn't show. It does not answer the central question of what happened to Nolan. What it does is add one more documented, verified piece to the timeline of a chaotic afternoon, and it raises its own question. How does a group dealing with a sinking boat, panicked enough to call for a rescue tow, end up leaving a friend behind on a remote, uninhabited island with no way to reach anyone? That question grew more complicated still when a young woman who had also been on Horn Island that day became part of the story. She was identified in media reports as 19-year-old Katie McCormick, who had been on the island with a separate group of friends. According to her sister, Gracie McCormick, Katie spoke with Nolan at some point that day and came away with the impression that he was getting ready to board the boat along with everyone else, and she assumed the friends telling him to get on wouldn't have simply left him behind. That account stands in direct tension with what Nolan's friends have said publicly, that he chose to stay on the island by his own decision. Gracie McCormick has said her family has fully cooperated with investigators and with the Wells family, and that Katie McCormick, who left the island separately with her brother and his fiancée, has not spoken publicly about the case herself. Attorney Ben Crump, representing Nolan's family, has pointed directly to that contradiction. As he put it at a press conference, one side says Nolan went to get on the boat, the other side says he never did, and somebody isn't telling the truth. Authorities have not publicly named any suspects or indicated they believe a crime occurred, but they also haven't resolved which version of that afternoon is accurate, or whether both accounts can somehow be reconciled. When Nolan didn't come home that night, his mother, Christine Wansley, reported him missing at midnight. That report set off a multi-day search operation coordinated between the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, the United States Coast Guard, and the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, combing the waters and shoreline around Horn Island and the surrounding barrier islands. On the night of July 5th, with her son still missing, Christine posted photos of Nolan that his friends had shared with her, asking the public for help finding him. Those posts spread quickly, well beyond the Mississippi coast, as people across the country began following the search. On the morning of July 6th, at approximately 8:45 a.m., a National Park Service ranger found a body in the water near the northwest tip of Horn Island. According to the sheriff's office, the body matched the description investigators had circulated for Nolan. Confirmation followed that afternoon, when Jackson County Coroner Bruce Lind identified the remains through dental records. Just before 1 p.m., the family confirmed Nolan's death publicly on social media, ending a search that had gripped the coast for 2 days and replacing it with a different, longer, and still unresolved search for answers. One detail from that search timeline has drawn particular scrutiny. According to reporting on the case, a friend of Nolan's placed a call to the United States Coast Guard around 11 p.m. on July 4th, the same night he went missing. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office, however, did not formally request Coast Guard assistance until around noon the following day, July 5th, a gap of roughly 13 hours between when someone first reached out to a federal rescue agency and when local authorities followed up with their own request for that same help. Neither the sheriff's office nor the family's legal team has offered a detailed public explanation for that gap, and it remains one of several timeline questions that has fueled public frustration with how the early hours of the search were handled. An autopsy was performed the next day, July 7th, by the Mississippi State Medical Examiner. Officials have said the results of that state autopsy will not be released publicly until after a grand jury has had the opportunity to review all of the evidence gathered in the investigation, a standard practice in Mississippi death investigations that, understandably, has done little to satisfy a family and a public hungry for information in real time. The same day the body was identified, Sheriff Ledbetter gave an interview to ABC News that would go on to become one of the most consequential and controversial moments of the entire case. Asked about the circumstances of Nolan's death, he said that at that point, there was no information suggesting a crime had taken place. To part of the public, and to Nolan's own family, that statement landed as premature, even careless. The state autopsy hadn't been completed. No toxicology results existed yet. And still, a public framing had already taken hold that this had likely been a tragic accident and nothing more. In the days that followed, as speculation about the case exploded across social media, the sheriff's department issued a statement acknowledging that growing online speculation and said its investigators were working methodically to establish the facts of the case through eyewitness accounts, physical evidence, and other reliable sources. The standard language used in any active investigation, but language that, in this particular case, struck many observers as insufficient, given how quickly the department's own sheriff had already offered a preliminary read on what had, or hadn't, happened. On July 7th, one day after Nolan's death was confirmed, his family retained attorney Ben Crump. Crump is one of the most recognizable civil rights attorneys in the United States, known nationally for representing the families of Black Americans in a number of high-profile cases involving questions about how their deaths were investigated and handled by local authorities. His involvement in the Wells case immediately elevated its national profile. Crump said publicly that Nolan's family deserved answers and deserved the truth, and he called on investigators to move with greater urgency and greater transparency than he felt they had shown so far. Crump's legal team went on to commission an independent, private autopsy, separate from the one already conducted by the state medical examiner, a step increasingly common in cases where a family has lost confidence in an official process. The preliminary results of that independent autopsy were announced by Crump in mid-July at a press conference held during the NAACP's National Convention in Chicago, alongside Nolan's parents, Christine and Elmore Wansley, and NAACP President and CEO Derek Johnson. The findings, Crump said, were inconclusive. The independent examiner, board-certified forensic pathologist Dr. Roger A. Mitchell, Jr., ruled the cause and manner of Nolan's death undetermined, pending further investigation, and said in his written report that he could not rule out the possibility that some non-accidental factor contributed to or caused Nolan's death. At the same press conference, Crump also acknowledged that the independent exam had not turned up direct evidence of wrongdoing either. It is, in other words, a finding that closes off no possibility and confirms none. A more detailed version of that report, reviewed later by CNN, described red discoloration found in the soft tissue at the back of Nolan's head. An outside forensic pathologist not otherwise connected to the case, Dr. Kendall Von Crowns, the chief medical examiner in Tarrant County, Texas, told CNN that this kind of discoloration could represent nothing more than ordinary decompositional changes in the muscle tissue, or it could potentially reflect a blunt force injury to the back of the head and neck, and that there was no way to determine which explanation was correct based on that finding alone. The report also underscored a broader forensic principle relevant to this case. When a body is recovered from the water and drowning is suspected, it becomes especially important to confirm exactly how that person entered the water in the first place, particularly for someone known to be a capable swimmer, as Nolan reportedly was. That detail, how and why Nolan ended up in the water at all, remains one of the most basic and still unanswered questions in the entire case. At that same NAACP press conference, Derek Johnson accused Mississippi investigators of mishandling the case, saying the organization was accusing state and local officials of being derelict in their duties to follow up and ensure a proper investigation, so that the family and the broader community could be assured that if anyone had been involved in Nolan's death, that would come to light. A week earlier, the NAACP's National Board of Directors had adopted a formal resolution of condolence for the Wells family, calling on local, state, and federal authorities, including the United States Department of Justice, to conduct what the resolution described as an in-depth and openly transparent review of how Nolan came to be left on the island, and of all activities in the hours leading up to when his body was recovered. 2 days earlier, at a memorial service held for Nolan in Ocean Springs, the Reverend Al Sharpton, who officiated the service, delivered a eulogy in which he said that the family wanted answers, not bias in either direction, just answers, and that closure for the family could only come through justice. Sharpton and filmmaker Tyler Perry also jointly offered reward money for information that could help move the investigation forward, a step that has become increasingly common in high-profile cases that stall without a clear resolution. That escalation didn't go unanswered by Mississippi officials. Following the NAACP's public criticism, a Mississippi state senator told Fox News Digital that both Sheriff Ledbetter and District Attorney Angel Myers McElrath have the utmost integrity, and officials in Nolan's hometown publicly rallied behind their sheriff in response to accusations that his department had been derelict in its duties. It marked a clear and public split, in other words, between how national civil rights organizations and how local Mississippi officials characterized the quality and pace of the investigation, a split that has only widened as the case has dragged on without resolution. By the fourth week after Nolan's death, that split had taken on an explicitly political dimension. Republican Mississippi Governor Tate Reeves, in a statement to Fox News Digital, placed responsibility for a wave of threats connected to the case squarely on Ben Crump and Al Sharpton, accusing them of stoking division for personal gain and saying that pattern was, in his words, how they've built their careers. Reeves did not provide evidence directly tying either man's public statements to any specific threat. Mississippi Department of Public Safety Commissioner Sean Tyndall confirmed separately that the FBI is investigating threats made against public officials, potential witnesses, the friends who were with Nolan in the hours before he disappeared, and members of the Wells family itself, including threats directed at Christine Wansley personally. Tyndall said publicly that making those kinds of threats against officials, witnesses, or a grieving family is itself a criminal act, and that intense public interest in the case, fueled in part by misinformation circulating online, had stirred what he described as rage and emotion that spilled over into real threats against real people. On the other side of the political aisle, U.S. Representative Andre Carson of Indiana accused Mississippi officials of failing to provide the family with transparency and accountability, pointing out that officials had retained some of Nolan's body parts for further examination, which he argued left the independent autopsy's already inconclusive findings even less complete. Authorities have not publicly linked either Crump or Sharpton to any of the threats under investigation, and as of this recording, neither man has issued a detailed public response to the governor's comments. Underneath all of that political noise sits the reason the case became a national flashpoint in the first place. Nolan Wells was the only black teenager in a group of white friends on that 4th of July boat trip, and that fact has shaped nearly every part of the public conversation around his death. Photos of the group from that day have been described by American press coverage as something like a Rorschach test for race relations in the country. Different people looking at the exact same images and coming away with entirely different interpretations of what they mean. For a significant part of the black community in the United States, the case reopened an old and painful discussion. The idea that cases involving missing or deceased black victims have historically drawn less urgency from police and less sustained attention from media than cases involving white victims, and that the sheriff's early public framing that there was no indication of a crime risked repeating exactly that pattern before the facts were fully known. Civil rights leaders have also pointed to Mississippi's broader history on questions of race, arguing that this history makes any ambiguity in a case like this one, involving a black teenager who died alone on an isolated island in the company of white friends, immediately loaded with historical and social weight, regardless of what the investigation ultimately concludes. That context helps explain why a case centered on a still undetermined cause of death on a remote and uninhabited island off the Mississippi coast grew into a story covered by essentially every major national news outlet in the country, drew a wave of civil rights leaders and elected officials into the conversation, and, as we've just discussed, became entangled in the broader, more familiar fight over which political and media figures can be trusted to tell the truth about it. Back in Ocean Springs, the case has reshaped daily life in a small coastal community that isn't used to national attention. Within the first 2 weeks, hundreds of people gathered more than once at the intersection of government and state streets downtown for peaceful demonstrations, carrying signs reading things like "Justice for Nolan Wells" and "Hope for Nolan," and chanting his name. Attendees ranged from teenagers who had known Nolan personally to parents and grandparents who said the case simply hit close to home. One resident, Quanah Green, said it could have easily been her own son. Another, Gordon Jackson, said Nolan could have easily been his own grandson and pointed to what he described as a long, historic pattern of young black men losing their lives under suspicious circumstances without adequate follow-up. Others at the demonstrations framed their presence less around any specific theory of what happened and more around a general demand that the investigation be conducted openly. Ocean Springs High School held a grief session for students and staff in its auditorium, and Ron Chambers, a member of the school district's board of trustees, urged the community in a public post not to become trapped by gossip, rumors, or sensationalism while the investigation continued. A caution worth taking seriously, given how much of the national conversation around this case has been shaped by unverified claims and viral speculation, rather than confirmed facts. Nolan's funeral was held on July 20th at Centerpoint Church in Ocean Springs, with a public visitation followed by a service attended by, among others, filmmaker Spike Lee and former NFL player Terrell Owens. Filmmaker Tyler Perry, who also helped fund reward money in the case, covered the cost of the funeral itself. Christine and Elmore Wansley, Nolan's parents, both spoke at the service. It's worth pausing to note that not everyone following this case sees a mystery rooted in human decisions at all. Some of the most experienced voices on the water have pointed instead to the ordinary, brutal physics of the Gulf. A leader with the Cajun Navy, the loosely organized volunteer rescue network that has assisted in flood and water rescues across the Gulf Coast for years, told reporters that the waters around Horn Island are known for strong, unpredictable currents, sometimes described locally as a washing machine effect, currents capable of overpowering even a strong, confident swimmer without warning. That same source suggested it's plausible that, if Nolan entered the water at some point after being left on the island, a wave or current ultimately carried his body to the location where the park ranger found it 2 days later. The Jackson County coroner has told reporters separately that his office has handled numerous drowning cases originating from Mississippi's barrier islands over the years, a grim but relevant piece of local context. None of this proves what happened to Nolan. But it is a reminder that, underneath every theory involving other people's choices or possible wrongdoing, a straightforward and tragic accidental drowning remains one of the possibilities investigators still have to formally rule in or rule out, and it's one that people with real, hard-won knowledge of these waters take seriously. As for where the official investigation currently stands, Sheriff Ledbetter has said his office has interviewed more than 60 witnesses so far, including the 3 friends who were on the boat with Nolan when he was reportedly last seen. The FBI has been assisting with the analysis of digital evidence in the case, not, according to the Sheriff's Department, because of suspicion of any specific federal crime, but because Horn Island itself is federal land, which makes that kind of interagency cooperation fairly routine in cases like this one. Attorneys for the Wells family have also said they are now working directly alongside investigators to examine Nolan's cell phone, which was not recovered with his body, but was instead found in the possession of one of the young men who had been with him on the island. Using the location tracking app Life 360, Christine Wansley has said she was able to track that device after the fact, and she has said that a number of messages on Nolan's social media accounts appeared to have been deleted, since Nolan, according to his family, was a frequent user of Snapchat. Yet there were no posts at all from the 24 hours before his death. It's important to be precise about the status of that claim. It comes from the family and their legal team, not from any conclusion the official investigation has confirmed or released. District Attorney Angel Myers-McElrath, who will ultimately decide whether to bring the case before a grand jury, has publicly defended both the pace and the integrity of the investigation, pushing back on suggestions from Crump's team that the process has been biased or slow-walked. She has said the case is being handled with the same process and the same level of care used in any death investigation in Jackson County, and has asked the community for patience, acknowledging the public's understandable urgency to know what happened while stressing that investigators have to protect the integrity of the case while it remains open. Other local officials have said their relative public silence about the specific evidence gathered so far is a legal requirement during an active investigation, not, as some critics have suggested, a sign of indifference toward Nolan or his family. Once the investigation is formally complete, it will fall to McElrath to decide whether to present the case to a grand jury. A group of ordinary citizens who would then review the evidence gathered by investigators and decide whether there is sufficient basis to bring any criminal charges against anyone. That process, standard in cases like this across Mississippi and much of the country, is confidential by design, which is part of why so much of what the public knows about the Wells case so far has come not from official statements, but from leaked or independently obtained material, the CETO recording, the preliminary findings of a privately commissioned autopsy, second-hand accounts from people who were on the island that day. It is a case being reconstructed in real time and in public from fragments. What we know, in the end, after 3 weeks of searching, autopsies, press conferences, political accusations, and competing witness accounts, is this: an 18-year-old went out for a holiday boat trip with friends and never came back. 2 days later, he was found dead in the water off a remote, federally protected island with no shelter, no phone service, and no way to call for help. To this day, no one, not the sheriff's office, not the state medical examiner, not the independent pathologist hired by his family, not the family itself, can say with certainty what happened to him in the hours between when his friends last saw him and when a park ranger found his body. Every new piece of evidence that has emerged, the CETO recording, Katie McCormick's conflicting account, the inconclusive independent autopsy findings, the detail of the missing phone, has added texture and detail to that timeline without resolving its central question. This kind of prolonged uncertainty is fertile ground for speculation, and this case has drawn no shortage of it on every side of the political and racial fault lines it now sits at the center of. But speculation is not an answer, and in the middle of a genuine information vacuum, the people who pay the highest price for that vacuum are not the pundits, the activists, or the officials issuing dueling statements. They are Nolan Wells' parents, still waiting, more than 3 weeks later, for someone to tell them what actually happened to their son. This video will be updated if and when the investigation or the grand jury process that will eventually follow it brings verified new facts to light. Until then, what remains is this: a name, a date, a series of documented but incomplete fragments, and an open question that Mississippi and the rest of the country watching it closely has not yet been able to answer.